Hello everyone, this is Rick. Welcome to episode 3 of Indian Political History series. Now, as you know that before discussing the core of Indian political history, we are discussing the sources of Indian politics. So today we have come forward with another important source, that is the Puranas. Puranas were very important in knowing about the political history of ancient India. We will see how was that, how was Puranas, how were the Puranas so important in knowing about Indian political history. So without doing any delay, let's get into details. Before we start with the Puranas as a source of political history, we will see what are the important things we will discuss in this presentation. So, meaning of Purana. It is derived from the idea that which has lived from ancient times. So, Puranas are important sources which have survived since the ancient times. Puranas are vital texts preserving India's historical, mythological, and religious traditions. So, Puranas preserve three kinds of traditions, that is, historical, mythological, and religious traditions. So, this is the text which has survived since ancient times, giving away important information about the history, mythology, and religion of the Indian subcontinent. They are mentioned in Atharva Veda, Brahmana Sutras, Brahmanas, Sutras, and Upanishads. So these texts are mentioned in the Vedas and other important texts of ancient India, like the Atharva Vedas, Brahmanas, Shrauta Sutras, and Upanishads. So highlighting their antiquity and connection to Itihas. So thus we get information how they were connected to the Itihas. Scope of study. This presentation covers their origin, definition, pañca-lakṣaṇa means five characteristics, classification into Mahapuranas and Upa-purāṇas and their historical evaluation. So all these things will be discussed in this presentation or in this episode. Development stages. We stress the stages from early mentions in Vedic text to their expansion between the 2nd and 6th centuries AD. So how did the the Puranas evolve? They were just mentioned as a text in the Vedic times, and later on during the 2nd to 6th centuries AD, they were expanded as a source of history, and later regularization by Alberuni in the 11th century. So later during the 11th century, they were organized in a much proper manner as stated by Alberuni. Historical value. Puranas provide dynastic genealogies, myth, history, geography, and references corroborated by Buddhist, Jain, and archaeological source. So Puranas are important because they provide the genealogical chart of the rulers. They provide mythological stories along with historicity hidden in them. They also give away a lot of information about geography, and all these references are corroborated with the help of Buddhist texts, Jain texts, and also archaeological sources. To understand the Puranas as literature, historical records, and cultural memory shaping ancient Indian history. So, we will understand the overall aim of this presentation is to understand how Puranas are important as literature, as historical records, and as a cultural memory, and thus how did it shape the ancient Indian history. Meaning and early references of the Puranas. So, what are the early references about the Puranas and what does the word Purana mean? So, definition of Puran. The term means that which has lived from ancient times, as has been stated in the Vayu Puran. volume 1, 203 number phrase. So what is the meaning of Puran? Puran means which is very old and which is still surviving from the ancient times, or a work recording past events. So this means that it is a collection of work which records the past events. Mahabharata traces the study of Itihasa Purana to augment the Vedas. So Mahabharata also lays emphasis on the study of Itihas, which means how it has been. Thus it was Itihasa. Vedic mentions Atharvaved, Satavada Brahmana, Sankhayana, Ashvalayana, Sutras, Chandogya Upanishad all mention Purana Itihas. So, according to the ancient sources, the word Purana has been equated with Itihas, and thus they are mentioned in many texts like Atharvaved, which is the last of the Vedas. Then we have extension of the Vedic texts like the Satapatha Brahmana. Sankhayana is a philosophical work. Ashvalayana, Sutras, Chandogya Upanishad all mention Puranas as Itihas. Terminology usage. Taittiriya Aranyaka uses Purana in plural. Atharvaved shows distinct religious literature besides the Vedas. So Taittiriya Aranyaka is a text which uses the word Puran in plural, means there was not only one Puran but many Puranas. Atharvaved shows that distinct religious literature was there besides the Vedas, means Puranas have been existing in many forms or in their plural forms, or many Puranas were existing since the time of Atharvaved. Nature of the Puranas, seen as historical works like Gathas, Narasamsis, Vakovakayas. So these are historical works according to what has been listed. They are historical works just like the Gathas, Narasamsis and Vakovakyas. So these are other historical works and Puranas are just like them. Authority. Apastambha Dharmasutra cites Bhavishyat Purana for food rules, showing growing authority. So by the time Apastambha Dharmasutra was written, we find that Bhavishwat Purana is giving away information regarding what type of rules should be followed by the society regarding consumption or food rules. Thus, we know that the Puranas had authority in the society. Smriti importance. Puranas mentioned in Smriti texts and Mahabharata. Kautilya include Puranas for with four Vedas. So Puranas are mentioned in the Smriti text and has also been mentioned in the epic Mahabharata. Kautilya includes Puranas with four Vedas, urges kings to hear Itihasa Purana and employ Pauranika officers to recite them. So even Kautilya in his Arthashastra has paid a lot of importance to the Puranas, saying that kings should appoint officers who will recite the Puranas to the kings. Characteristics and classification of Puranas. So what are the important characteristics of Puranas and how has it been classified? Chronology. Through though ancient, extant Puranas likely date 2nd to 6th century AD. So many of the Puranas or most of the Puranas were written down in about 2nd to 6th century AD. Now this is not the date of the composition of the Puranas. This is the date when the Puranas were written down. Definition. Amarakosha defines Purana with pañca-lakṣaṇa. So in Puranas there should be five characteristics or pañca-lakṣaṇa. What are the five characteristics? What are the five things which the Puranas will definitely have to discuss? They are sarga, means they will have to discuss the creation. Then pratisarga, means they will have to discuss the dissolution and recreation. Then they will have to discuss vaṁśa, means genealogies, the hereditary history of the gods and kings. Then they will have to discuss manvantara, means the age of Manus. And then they will have to discuss vaṁśānucarita, means the history of kings. So these are the five things which the Puranas are definitely supposed to discuss while being written. Mahapuranas list. So there are 18 Mahapuranas recognized. What are they? Brahma Purana, Padma Purana, Vishnu Purana, Vayu Purana, Bhagavata Purana, Naradiya Purana, Markandeya Purana, Agni Purana, Vavishwa Purana, Brahma Vaitvarta Purana, Linga Purana, Varaha Purana, Skanda Purana, Vamana Purana, Kurma Purana, Matsya Purana, Garuda Purana, Brahmanda Purana. So these are the 18 Mahapuranas which have been recognized. Upa-Purāṇas. Upa-Purāṇas, how many Upa-Purāṇas are there? 18 are mentioned, but around 100 traced. Number 18 likely symbolic, not original. So there are 18 Upa-Purāṇas mentioned, but around 100 Upa-Purāṇas have been found out. Now this number 18 has something to do with religion and ritualistic opinion, but it is not original. There are not 18 Upapuranas but much more. Content expansion. Only less than 3% of extant Mahapuranas follow pañca-lakṣaṇa. Inflation added Smriti, philosophy, grammar, geography, architecture, and sectarian myths. So, only about 3% of the Mahapuranas actually follow the five characteristics basing on which the Puranas are supposed to be written. So they diverted a lot from the original five characteristics and they added Smriti, philosophy, grammar, geography, architecture, and sectarian myths. Development stages of the Puranas. How did the Puranas develop to what we know it as today in different stages? So, Dr. Kane's first stage, period of Atharva Veda, Satapatha, Chandogya Upanishad, when Purana held sacredness linked with Itihas analogous to Veda. So, during this time, the first stage of Purana, as has been said by Dr. Kane, was the time where Puranas were contemporary to Atharvaved, Satapatha Brahmana, Chandogya Upanishad. And this was the time when Puranas were considered to be sacred. They were tied with Itihas and were almost in similar status as the Vedas. Second stage was the time when Puranas were contemporary with Tattariya Aranyaka, Apastamba Dharmasutra, mentions Puranani, earliest three Puranas, and cites Bhavishyat Purana on social food codes. So this was the time when Puranas had authority. As we know that Bhavishyat Purana gave a lot of instructions regarding consumption of food. Third stage was by 3rd to 4th century BC, where we find existence of a Bhavishvat Purana and other Puranas noted, containing sarga, pratisarga, and smriti material. So this was the third stage where the status of the Purana decreased a lot, and it was the text which contained sarga, pratisarga, and smriti material. Evolution, continuous addition of varied content beyond original Pancha-lakṣaṇa. So, as we move forward in time, we will see that Puranas have diverted from their original view of five characteristics, that is Pancha-lakṣaṇa, and they varied a lot in content and lot of things were added to the Puranas. Integration with Smriti. Puranas absorbed matters of philosophy, mythology stories, and sectarian themes, becoming authoritative texts for later Hindu tradition. So, Puranas were the texts which absorbed matters regarding philosophy, mythology, stories, and many themes according to different sects of religion, and thus they became very much authoritative texts for the later Hindus or later Hindu tradition. Later stages in the development of Puranas. What were the later stages concerned with the evolution of the Puranas? Third stage, between 3rd century BC and 3rd century AD, Yajnavalkya regarded Puranas as a source of dharma. So, according to Yajnavalkya, the third stage of the development of Puranas, which happened in between 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD, we see that Puranas were important source of dharma. Fourth stage, by 9th century AD, most principal Puranas were written, though later additions continued. So, by the 9th century AD, most of the main Puranas were written, and later additions, means editing of the Puranas with numerous additions, still continued. Matsya Purana refers to downfall of the Guptas, but not the Guptas directly, suggesting compilation before Gupta accession. So Matsya Purana refers to the downfall of the Gupta dynasty, but they have not been reported, or they have not been referenced directly, which means that most of the Matsya Puranas were compiled before the coming of the Gupta dynasty. Dating and shape, finalized by 3rd century AD, before Samudragupta's reign. Some texts mention Gupta kings but omit names, supporting early formation. So, many of the Puranas were composed by 3rd century AD, because many Puranas mention the name of the Guptas but they omit the names in particular. Thus, we get an idea that they were formed much earlier than the coming of the Guptas. Independent corroboration. Puranic references to Chandragupta I's kingdom match other sources. So there, the history that we get from the Puranas have been corroborated by other texts also. And so there is an instance where we get references of Chandragupta I's kingdom, and this reference has been corroborated from other sources. Transmission. Additions continued through Andhra dynasty period, reflecting sectarian needs and dharma emphasis. So, through the evolution of times, Puranas have been evolved and they were added with more informations right up to the time of Andhra dynasty. Thus, the Puranas have been edited many times according to the needs of various religious sects and the need of dharma. It has been edited many times. Alberuni and regularization of the Puranas. So Alberuni is a foreigner who visited India during 11th century. What did he say about the Puranas? Alberuni's account, by 11th century Puranas were regularized. Alberuni listed 18. So Alberuni listed the names of 18 Puranas. What are they? Adi, Matsya, Kurma, Varaha, Narasimha, Vamana, Vayu, Nanda, Skandha, Aditya, Soma, Samba, Brahmanda, Markandeya, Tarkarakshaya, Vishnu, Brahma, Bhavishya. So these are the 18 Puranas as has been listed in 11th century by the foreign traveler Alberuni. Identification issue, numbers 1, 5, 8, 10, 11 and 12 are likely Upa-Purāṇas. So Puranas like Adi, Narasimha, these are Upa-Purāṇas, and Alberuni couldn't differentiate between the Upa-Purāṇas and the Puranas, and so Alberuni added all these into his list of Mahapuranas to make the number 18. So Alberuni probably adjusted the list to 18. Symbolism of 18. Total figure for Mahapuranas. Though total Upapuranas exists 100. So there are 18 Mahapuranas which has been attributed by all scholars of ancient Indian history, but Upapuranas are more than 100 in numbers. Dr. R. C. Hajra's study. Extremely complicated problem. Hajra assigned dates or periods but was criticized by M. Kane. Significance. By Alberuni's time, Puranas were firmly established in Hindu tradition. So, by the time of Alberuni, Puranas were very much authoritative texts in Hindu traditions. They held a lot of power in Hindu tradition. Functions and oral traditions of the Puranas. What are the functions and how were Puranas seen as oral traditions? Historical records. Puranas quote Anavamsha slokas or gathas about kings like Kartavirya and Aila Akshvaka dynasty. So all these kings have been mentioned in Puranas. Many dynasties have been mentioned and gathas or stories about those kings are written in the Puranas. Reciters. Puranikas preserved genealogical verses. So Puranikas were the officers who were appointed by the king to take care of the recitation and conservation of the Puranas. So they preserved the genealogical verses. Mahabharata also refers to shlokas, gathas, and anavamshas. So Mahabharata also refers to different kinds of shlokas, gathas, and anavamshas from the Puranas, and the duty of the Pauranikas was to preserve the genealogical verses. Pariplava tradition. Royal genealogies resided in cycles of 10 days for a year. So, royal genealogies were recited in cycles of 10 days for a year. So, for 10 days, Puranas were recited, mainly focusing on the portion where royal genealogies were written. Shlokas sung by lute players. So, slokas were sung out by lute players, gathas by birds, and supervised by Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. This tradition is called Pariplava tradition, in which the Puranas were read out to audience with great show. Shankaracharya's commentary on Brahma Sutra noted Upanishadic stories were included in Puranas but not to be recited during Pariplava. So Shankaracharya said that even though Upanishadic stories are included in Purana, they are not to be recited during the Pariplava tradition. Dr. Hajra's theory linked Purana pañca-lakṣaṇa and Mahabharata origins to Ashwamedha sacrifice and Pariplava Akhayanas. Akhanyas. So, according to Dr. Hajra, the origin of the Puranas or the Ashwamedha sacrifice is to be taken as the source from which Panchalakshana and Mahabharata originated, but was severely criticized by M. Kane. So, according to Dr. Hajra, during the Ashwamedha sacrifice, the five characteristics of Puranas and the Mahabharata came into origin, but this view was not at all liked or supported by M. Kane. Genealogical values of the Puranas. How does Purana act as an important source of genealogy of different dynasties? Unique source. Puranic genealogies are crucial for early dynasties where no other material survives. So In many cases, the early dynastic history of a dynasty can only be known from the Puranas because no other materials survive. Confirmation. Mentions of Vakataka branch mentions of Vakataka branch Vatsagulmas were later confirmed by inscriptions. So Vakataka dynasty has a branch called the Vatsagulmas. These were the early branches of a dynasty which did not have any other source. Only they were written in the Puranas. Later on we came to know about them from different other inscriptions. So thus many of the genealogical information given in the Puranas are corroborated by other literary and archaeological sources. Limitations. Puranas are not always reliable, yet along with epics, they provide the only list of kings of early dynasties. So Puranas are not always very reliable, but along with the epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, they provide the only source, they act as the only source about the genealogical history of different early dynasties. Chronology. Lists trace the rulers from the first king to 3rd to 4th century AD. Earlier portions appear mythical, later ones historical. So hundreds of kings are named one after another up to 3rd to 4th century AD. The later kings are actually true or are actually parts of history because they have been known from many other archaeological and literary sources also, but the earlier portions of the list of genealogies may have been mythical. Historical testimony. Megasthenes reported a list of Indian kings from Bacchus to Alexander, showing such traditions existed by 3rd to 4th century BC. So Megasthenes also reported a list of Indian kings from the time of Alexander, and thus we came to know that listing the genealogical structure of dynasties where a system was a system which existed from 3rd to 4th century BC. Alberuni's criticism. He observed that Hindus were careless with chronology and relied on tale telling. So, according to Alberuni, Hindus were not that much serious regarding noting down the exact dates of events. They believed in the philosophy of storytelling, and thus it was through stories that our history have been preserved. Scholarly reception and reliability. So, how did the scholars see to this information and how much of it was reliable? Initial rejection. Early modern scholars dismissed Puranic dynasties lists as unreliable. So, early scholars of this century they did not pay any attention to the Puranic dynastic lists and said that these were unreliable. Later acceptance. By 6th century BC, records of ruling dynasties gained credibility. So by 6th century BC, uh, the list after 6th century BC always has been proved to be true because they have been corroborated by other literatures like the Buddhist literature, and also we find several archaeological sources regarding those rulers who have been mentioned in the Puranas. Mahabharata context. Dynasties before the Great War were also considered sources, though scholars hesitated to accept details. So, in Mahabharata war, the dynasties have been mentioned. So, there is a confusion regarding the dynasties which have been mentioned to have existed in India before the Great War. So those details are not always accepted by the scholars of history. Purgitor's effort. So F.E. Purgitor pioneered attempts to reconstruct skeleton of political history from the Puranic genealogies. Challenges. Divergences in traditions and fragmentary data complicated conclusions, making results unsatisfactory. So, Puranas have diverted from traditions many times, and the datas are not at all organized, they are fragmented. And so, the construction of political history from the Puranas is an unsatisfactory task. Caution: attempts to outline dynastic history before the Great War are still considered hypothetical and incomplete. So, the dynasties which have been mentioned to have existed before the Mahabharata war may not have been true. Hypothesis on early dynasties. Time frame between 1000 to 600 BC, a working hypothesis of dynastic history can be attempted. So, a working hypothesis has been made. Limitations: a firm grasp of northern India's dynastic thread emerges only from 6th century BC. So, confirmed genealogical structures of the early dynasties of northern India emerge from about 6th century BC. Indian texts, especially Puranas, remain main sources from 6th century BC history. So, what were the historical sources about the dynasties before 6th century BC? We can only know from the Puranas. So, Puranas are the only source of information regarding the history of different dynasties which existed before 6th century BC. Supplementary evidence: Buddhist and Jain texts, Puranic references, and isolated mentions in grammar and literary works also continue. So, there are other evidences which mention what Puranas have exactly mentioned. So, the the way to corroborate the history in Puranas along with the other sources like Buddhist and Jain texts is an ongoing research. Geographical insights. Puranas, notably the Vayu, preserve geographical knowledge extending beyond India. So, if we go through Vayu Puran, and this is very interesting, we get information about geography of the world, not only India. So, how did the ancient people know about the geography of the world? By staying in India only. Western validation. Lieutenant J. H. Speck recognized Puranic value when tracing Nile sources influenced by Wilford's Asiatic researches. So, scholars like J. H. Speck and Wilford have given a lot of importance to the Puranas. Scholarly assessment. Professor Ali argued that Puranic geographical descriptions align with many Sanskrit sources. So, the geography of the world, as has been stated in the Puranas, are aligning with many other Sanskrit sources. Buddhist and Jain contributions. How did the Buddhist and Jain writings help to corroborate the history that has been mentioned in the Puranas? Suttas, Vinaya texts, and Jataka offer various valuable historical material. So, these are the texts which offer many other historical information. Archaeological evidence. Votive inscriptions at Varhut and Sanchi date to 2nd to 1st centuries BC. So, there are inscriptions in Varhut and Sanchi which gives out a lot of information about the history of 2nd and 1st century BC. Depictions in art, railings and gateways of stupas illustrate Jataka stories. So there are railings and gateways of stupas and they illustrate a lot about the stories that has been mentioned in the Jatakas. Dating of texts. Jatakas in Pali canon written down in 1st century BC. So Jatakas were written down in Pali during the 1st century BC. Historical merit. Provide details about kings like Bimbishar and preserve ancient traditions. So just like the Puranas, these texts also give us details about important kings like Bimbishar, and they preserve the ancient tradition. Reliability issues. Brahmanical accounts often failed, but Buddhist versions gave continuity. So, Brahmanical accounts like the Puranas often fail to give a concrete information regarding history, but Buddhist versions give out very nice informations which we corroborate with the Puranas. Jaina text. Some sacred works predate 2nd century AD, though canon was fixed only by 5th to 6th century AD. Their evidence, though valuable, is considered less reliable. So Jaina texts are not as much reliable as the Buddhist sources. Now we will discuss the sources which you can read for further information and also to verify the information I have presented in this whole video. So since we have already discussed all these information, I will just read out the sources. Vedic texts Atharva Veda, Satapatha Brahmana, Sankhayana, Ashvalayana, Shrauta Sutras, Chandogya Upanishad, and Tattariya Aranyaka, which provide early references to Purana and Itihasa. Dharmasūtras and Smritis. Apastamba Dharmasūtras, citing Bhavishyat Purana, Manusmriti, and mentions in Arthashastra by Kautilya. Epic sources. Mahabharata emphasizing the role of Itihasa Purana along with the Vedas. Lexicons and commentaries. Amara Kosha defining pañca-lakṣaṇa. Sankacharya's commentary on Brahmana Sutra. Alberuni's India, Megasthenes' records of dynasties and later Western evaluations. Modern scholarship, works of V. S. Suthankar, G. H. Bhatt, R. C. Hajra, and M. M. Kane. Corroborative literature, Buddhist sutras, Vinaya texts, Jatakas, and Jaina canons, along with archaeological inscriptions and genealogical records. So that was all about the Puranas. We have seen what does the word Puran mean and how it has evolved across centuries in the Indian subcontinent. We have also seen how Puranas with a compilation of mythology and history have helped in preserving the historical tradition of India, which has been later corroborated by different sources. We have also discussed the reliability of the Puranas in the context of Indian political history. So that was all for today. In our next video, we will discuss about the other historical sources which help to reconstruct the political history of India. And if you have any doubts, or if you want to provide more information, or if you want to criticize the information which I have given, then comments are always open for you. Thank you for your love and patience.